September 1st, 1939, is the date printed in almost every textbook for the start of the Second World War, but the fuse for that conflict was lit much earlier. To understand how the globe caught fire, we have to rewind to the 1920s. Following the devastation of the First World War, world leaders established a new global architecture. They drafted the Treaty of Versailles and formed the League of Nations, an international body designed to resolve disputes through diplomacy rather than artillery. But this system had a fatal structural flaw. The League possessed no standing army. It relied entirely on its member nations to enforce its rulings, and those nations were exhausted, bankrupt, and deeply unwilling to risk their citizens in another armed conflict. Because the major powers telegraphed their reluctance to fight, they created a massive geopolitical blind spot. Rising authoritarian regimes watched this hesitation closely, eager to test exactly how far they could push international borders before anyone actually pushed back. The first major test of this fragile peace came in 1931. The Empire of Japan staged a bombing on a railway, known as the Mukden Incident, and used it as a pretext to invade the resource-rich region of Manchuria in northern China. Japanese troops quickly engaged in urban combat, seizing control of the territory. China appealed directly to the League of Nations for help. The League investigated and issued a formal condemnation of the invasion. In response, Japan simply withdrew from the organization. Without military or economic backing, the condemnation meant practically nothing. Fascist Italy was taking notes. Seeing Japan's success, Benito Mussolini launched his own imperial campaign in 1935. Italian forces marched out of their bordering colonies and invaded the sovereign nation of Ethiopia. This time, the League of Nations attempted to impose economic sanctions to starve the Italian war effort, but the sanctions were riddled with loopholes. Crucial resources like oil were exempt, and the half measures failed entirely to halt the occupation. These two consecutive, unpunished invasions shattered the illusion of international law. They provided a proven, effective blueprint for territorial expansion. Move aggressively, ignore the diplomatic outrage, and keep the land. European fascists were ready to apply this exact method. In March 1936, Adolf Hitler ordered German troops to march directly into the Rhineland. This explicitly violated the Treaty of Versailles, but Hitler calculated, correctly, that the West would not intervene. The limited diplomatic backlash from Western democracies had an unintended consequence. It pushed these expansionist states together. Germany, Italy, and eventually Japan formalized their shared interests, signing agreements that would form the Axis powers. By 1938, Germany annexed Austria and set its sights on the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia. Seeking to avoid war at any cost, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and France championed appeasement, a strategy of making material concessions to an aggressive power to avoid conflict. At the Munich Agreement, they simply conceded the territory to Germany in exchange for a promise of peace. But the most alarming diplomatic maneuver came in August 1939. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, two states with violently opposed ideologies, signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin agreed to a treaty of non-aggression with Hitler. This map shows a secret protocol hidden inside the treaty. The two powers agreed to partition Poland, carving Eastern Europe into exclusive spheres of influence. This secured Hitler's eastern flank, removing the threat of a two-front war. His military could now focus entirely westward. The post-war peace architecture was now completely dismantled. Western appeasement had allowed the German military to rebuild and expand, while the Soviet Pact provided the strategic security to use it. A new continental conflict was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. On September 1, 1939, Germany executed its invasion of Poland. German forces physically tore down the Polish border crossings, operating under the assumption that Britain and France would once again issue condemnations and concede the territory. Just over 2 weeks later, the Soviet Union invaded Poland from the east. The grim reality of the secret Molotov-Ribbentrop Protocol played out in the streets, as Polish forces were crushed between two massive armies. This was the breaking point. Britain and France realized that appeasement had failed entirely. They honored their defensive guarantees to Poland, and on September 3rd officially declared war on Germany. This map shows how those declarations of war acted as a geographic chain reaction. The ongoing combat in China, the tensions in Africa, and the fresh violence in Europe were no longer isolated incidents. They merged into a single, massive, interconnected theater of combat. World War II did not begin out of nowhere with a single surprise attack in the autumn of 1939. It was the ultimate, cataclysmic cost of a decade filled with unenforced international laws, broken treaties, and a global reluctance to confront regional aggression until it was far too late.